Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is D.W. Gibson, and we are here to talk about the book, 1 Week to Change the World. So can you tell us what this week was? It was a pretty significant week.
It was a significant week that I think has been lost in history. And I think that's what motivated me to do this. So it was Seattle, 1999, end of the millennium. And the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is just a few years old at that point, is meeting in Seattle for ministerial. So all of the delegates from around the world that are a part of the WTO at that point coming together, and they want to reach a sweeping agreement that basically gives the WTO the ability to set the rules for international trade and to enforce those rules, right? And this is the age of Clinton globalism, right? Trying to bring the world economies in together. And so there were a lot of people that were concerned about this. For starters, unions that had already seen what economic globalization could do with the NAFTA agreement. And basically anybody who's invested in democracy, right? Anyone who's invested in localizing decision-making, because you had, the idea is that any nation state can be overruled by the WTO if they were able to put together this agreement. So basically 50,000 protesters from so many backgrounds and interest groups came together with a goal. There was a core group of organizers, and they stated a goal before the meetings that they wanted to shut down those meetings and prevent the WTO from reaching a new agreement. And over the course of a week, 5 days, they did just that. They shut down the first day of meetings by clogging up 12 intersections around the convention center there in Seattle through nonviolent protest. Delegates weren't able to meet to reach the meetings that they were supposed to reach. They had to shut down the meetings on that first day. And then the rest of the week never got back on track. They weren't able to really gain the energy they were looking for to reach that agreement. Some of the delegates inside the meeting started pushing back, and they had to leave town on Friday without a new agreement. So a really consequential week where protesters set a goal and meet that goal. And you can see the fingerprints of these protests and this organizing all over a lot of the movements of the past 25 years.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for that brief introduction. I mean, a few things from me. I'm going to try to be mostly you talking, but I guess there's some things I got to get off my chest. One, which is, so I was born in 1983. So I was in high school when this happened. And, following it on the news, we were talking about it in my government class, but I just remember thinking, what the fuck? I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I didn't know what the WTO was. I didn't know what the fuss was about. We were seeing footage of, this war zone in one of America's most prosperous cities. Back then we watched things like CNN, and I just remember being absolutely befuddled by it. And finally, with your book, and even more, frankly, that summary you just gave, I feel like that was a really clarifying moment that, as maybe someone who was a little older than me would have gotten that summary from the New York Times, maybe, but I wasn't reading the New York Times when I was 16 years old. I don't know.
No, and I am a few years older than you. I was born in 78, so I was college age when this happened, and I shared that exact same experience. I had a sense of scale. I knew whoa, something's happening here. I just need, even in terms of number of bodies in the street and that kind of thing. But I really had no clue what was at the heart of it. And I think that was part of my motivation here too, to go back, 25, now 26 years later, to really, on a selfish level, understand it myself and see how it connects to so much that's happened since. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the next thing for me to say is, and, terms are always difficult, and I'm sure the way I use these terms will offend some people, but I would like to make the case there's this thing called the new anarchism, and you can go to the Wikipedia page, and there's arguments of whether there is a new anarchism and not a new anarchism, and Chomsky and Graeber are writing articles about what is and isn't new anarchism. But let's just say, insofar as people exist today who call themselves anarchists, many of them, their thoughts and ideas and practices were deeply shaped by what happened at the Battle at the Battle of Seattle in 1999, and it's more likely if someone is an anarchist today that it in some ways involved radicalization around the battle in Seattle or Occupy Wall Street than that they are a member of an ethnic immigrant factory labor workforce listening to German radicals speaking on the streets of Chicago. And if someone were an anarchist 100 years ago or 125 years ago, at least in the United States, it would probably be that second category that made them an anarchist. And that's why I would broadly say there is something called new anarchism, and broadly, and you could write, and people have written entire books on this, the battle in Seattle is the catalyst for, quote, the new anarchism. That's just something I need to get out there. You can respond to that or not, as you wish.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think one of the defining characteristics, I do think there is something to this, a notion of new anarchism. And for me, it's sort of like confronting some of the issues that you're right were around 100 years ago, but in a global context, in a supersized context. I was just reading with my daughter. They have a young version of People's History of the United States, and just a couple of nights ago, we were reading, the section about the 1920s and the Wobblies and the IWW, and my God, it all felt like 1999.
Yes.
But when you get to 99, it's like this supercharged thing, right? It's not sort of fighting robber barons and the railroads and factories. It's really international conglomerates that are really seizing control of nation states, right? That are it's corporate governance. I mean, that's the phrase that really always sticks for me. That sort of international corporate governance that was starting to take hold during the Clinton administration, and that is, just blown up since then.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I guess the one last thing I'm going to say, listeners have heard me say this before, and this is, again, part of sort of like polemical arguments about what anarchism is and where it fits in, is I personally, I'm not a Marxist, or I'm not very sympathetic to Marxian analysis. I don't like when people are talking about the class struggle. At least as an intellectual historian of the 19th century, which is what my training is in, when people said class, they meant a group of people who often spoke the same language if they were immigrants, but lived in the same street very often, worked in the same place, all knew each other. They were, in the words of Jane Addams, already organized. A class was like an army, and it was an army being led by a capitalist who hated and feared them, but needed them. And so the class project, what was called class warfare, was to get that army to realize that all they had to do was seize the means of production, and the capitalists just disappear. So that's class warfare in the 19th century. I think that was a great idea. The socialists didn't win. And when people say like, oh, we need to practice class warfare, I think, well, I mean, sure, if by class warfare you mean fight the capitalists, sure. But if you mean all of us who are already all together working side by side in the thousands, we need to link arms and fuck the capitalists, that's not going to happen. It's a different world now. And what you're talking about with these global conglomerates and all of these different groups, or organizing was easier back then because they were already all organized. This is the dawn of the internet and the dawn of globalization, and this book just nails that.
Well, and so, yeah, I mean, those two things stand out to me in what you just said there, sort of that historic context and the sort of intimacy, if you will, of the people that were organizing, right? They knew each other. They shared neighborhoods and buildings and things like that. And then fast forward to 1999, you're right, introduction of internet. This is the first time we have the internet as an organizing tool. But I think it's really important to understand that it was really internet 1.0, right? And there's no social media. Like, they're harnessing, like, is one of the individuals I interviewed talked about sort of the URLs he would write for the websites were like, 100 characters long, right? And it was like listservs and emails. Like, that was it. But that was really something, because then you could broadcast out to people all around the world what you were doing and gain interest. And indeed, it was a global gathering. You had farmers from France and farmers from Korea, and you had people from all over the world that came to Seattle. But the thing that really stood out to me, this is so essential, I think, is that it was a hybrid, right? You had the internet there, but it was a tool. It wasn't the end game. It wasn't all of it. It was just one thing that was assimilated into everything they were still doing. They were doing teach-ins. They were going around the country in vans and buses, gathering in concert halls and in physical spaces and talking about the WTO, trying to help people understand what it was and what it was trying to do. So this hybrid between using physical space, meeting people in the real world, working together in Seattle for months and months and months before the protest. They had a physical space called the Convergence Space, where they were building puppets, where you could go and get food. You could find a place to stay if you were coming for the protest. That physical location was key. And I think that if you fast forward to the context we're in right now in 2025, you realize that I think we've become too reliant on the internet as some kind of central post for how things get done. I'll never forget, I was at Columbia University back with the protest for the war and for Palestine. And I remember there was a group of students who were I was talking to them and they were sort of distracted saying, oh, we're supposed to meet some other people here. We've been going back and forth with them online. And they were just realizing in that moment that they had no idea what the people looked like that they were looking for. Mm-hmm. But they've been talking to them for months and months and making all these plans and all of that. And so that captured it perfectly in my mind. There has to be some marriage between that sort of old school civic engagement, localized. What matters to the person living right next door to you? What matters to the person down the block and in the same city? Those are the most crucial things. And then how does that relate to people that are in the same situation across the country or across the world?
Yeah, and my most recent interview with Cory Doctorow got cut a little short because he had to go talk to Adam Conover. He was like, I gotta catch a car across town, so we didn't talk for very long. But one of the things he sort of ended with that interview in, and I didn't get a chance to disagree with him, is that organizing is easier now because of the internet, and it is easier now because of the internet. It's also harder. It's organizing. There's new things you can do with the internet, and I would say on balance, it's harder now. And one thing I haven't covered in this podcast yet is the Arab Spring, which was very much a sort of social media driven movement that also I think pretty much has nothing to show for it these days, although that probably has more with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia weaponry lobbed at those various people who participated in the Arab Spring than Twitter. But nevertheless, it's a little gaseous. It's a little vaporous.
That's exactly it. And Dave Taylor, a college student at the time, who's in my book, he really captured it best because he's continued to organize over the last couple of decades, and he was involved with some of the climate action that was done back in 2015, I think, where they did 2,000 events around the world in one day. Remarkable. And he said that's amazing that we were able to do that, but there's a big difference between organizing a successful action or protest and building a sustainable movement, right, over time. And I think that's the difference. The internet allows you to create connective tissue and create events in short order. But that movement, that sustained movement, comes from the social fabric that you only get when you really develop relationships over time. And that's not something we know. If we're turning to social media to develop our relationships over time, it's way, way, way wrong.
Yeah, no argument here. I want to talk. I mean, I've got lots of stuff I want to say about the book. I want to talk about anarchism. I want to talk about some of the police tactics. But before we get there, though, I want to know if there's more you want to say or cover about just the general thrust of what happened. You gave the 2-minute summary. It was wonderful. And if that's enough, I mean, look, I guess I'll say this now. I found this book thrilling. It was a page turner. If you listen to this podcast and you hear me discuss these dense academic tomes, I think you should read those if you can. But this is not this is a pleasure to read. Put it in a left winger's Christmas stocking, and they're not going to be like, oh no, this is 500 pages of Chomsky. They're going to be like, yes, there's only like 5 pages of Chomsky in here. And I mean, I like Chomsky's writing, but this is a fun book to read. I highly recommend it. And before we start delving into it, I want to know if there was more you wanted to say about the overall picture that you paint.
Yeah, I one note, and I appreciate you saying that. And I really did try to make it a story, right? I mean, make it an engaging story, because I think that that's the only way you're going to get people to really care about it. But I do want to say that even just sort of thinking about these echoes of labor movements and anarchism 100 years ago, I think that the one thing to note, because going back to what I was just saying, okay, well, so they were successful with this protest here, shut down the meetings, but sustained movement, did that happen? I don't know that necessarily happened. It really kind of didn't. And I think one of the big reasons, and I don't think it's about excuse making, but I really think it's about dissecting the historic context. When you came out of Seattle after that success, the people who organized were on fire. And the AFL-CIO, which was so scared to really get involved, afterwards are like, yeah, let's do it again. Let's do it bigger, right? Everyone was getting all in. In the year 2000, people were planning similar protests against the IMF. And it was really just this thing. There was so much energy in the air. And then 9/11, right? 9/11 happens, and that throws everything off whack. And I think that, there's this truth that's reoccurring, and Lisa Fithian points this out in the book. That killed the movement when 9/11 happened, and we went into all these wars, because it dragged all of the energy that was pushing back on globalization, pushing back on globalized capitalism, to be specific, and it channeled it all into the anti-war movement. And throughout, you saw this happen with the IWW in World War I, And so there are ways that it's always easier to get people roped in with the idea of patriotism, right? And it scares power structures when people are upset, because you were speaking to this earlier about anyone who is subjected to the system of capitalism fits in this bucket of pushing, a candidate for pushing back on it. And that scares the system. Patriotism, tapping into notions of patriotism, is a good way to divert from that fight and create a new fight that's much more winnable for the state.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty well-established reading of history. At least it's a well-established anarchist reading of history, that when the German socialists throw in their lot with the Kaiser, the coming. When you read the people in the 19th century, they're sure that the revolution is coming. They're sure that the revolution is coming, and the revolution does come. It's called World War I. It's not class warfare, but it is something that splits the world and creates a new order. And it does seem that the German socialists had a chance to say, the war, they're trying to have the war, but we are going to have class war instead. And the German socialists instead say, all right, the fatherland, let's do this. Let's go kill the French and the Brits. And that's, we still haven't gotten to the point of revolutionary fervor that we had back then in 1914.
Yeah. Agreed. Fully agreed. And I think that to me is the historic model. Obviously, I pull out 1999. I think that's a living history that we can all relate to and is much more immediate for us. We can recognize things like the people's microphone and this is what democracy looks like and things like that. But 1914 and that window of time is really the historic window that I think is most illuminating for 2025 going into 2026.
So let me say now, talking about the book, so it's a thrilling book. It's what's called an oral history. I think these are maybe increasingly popular. You can read them online. Book length ones are rarer, but I've read a few. There's some major upsides to this model. The downside is that overarching summary that you gave me at the beginning of this podcast, that appears nowhere in this book. And look, I'm willing to say, you don't have to accept this label, I'm willing to say that this is an anarchic model, a conversation. Graeber says is a form of anarchism, and I agree with it. It feels like a conversation. You have the people say, oh my God, being pepper sprayed by the cops was so horrible. And then you have the cops say, I wish we had hit them harder. And those are just both there. D.W. Gibson does not weigh in voice of God style, on anything. And I'm just curious, since I do think this worked so well, if you're also concerned that there's people who who don't know what happened in 1999, and 300 years later, they're gonna 300 pages later, they're gonna have this amazing sense of what it was like to be there, but still not necessarily grasp what happened. The flip side is any master narrative you give is going to be flawed and a lie in some way. So I guess that's your out. But now, just I wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, and I wrestle with this. Let me tell you, and I mean, and there were sort of creative questions and also practical questions. I mean, I had a publisher who was beating on my door to make sure I got this turned in, and so that was a factor as well. There are always the practical considerations. I think, for me, the sort of a lot of the editorial process for me was in assembling the book. Right? I mean, there's a lot of trust too put from all of the people that I interviewed. And I would conduct interviews, bare minimum an hour, but a lot of cases, a couple of hours. And then many cases going back to people for a couple hour interviews. So I'm talking about over 1,000 pages of transcripts, right? So I've got to take all of that. My writing process for this book is taking all of that raw material and arranging it, like creating a composition, right? I like to think about it as like a chorus of voices, and I'm creating this arrangement. And I have to admit that in that process, I'm making all kinds of choices, right? And I'm shaping things. I would be lying if I said otherwise. I can tell you all about my intentions. I can tell you about how I listen as carefully as I can. And I really try to stay true to what everyone is telling me. But I'm making subjective choices along the way. And so I decided, given the tight time frame I had to work on this book, I decided that was going to be how I involved myself. And it's naked. So you can see it there and you can make judgments about how well I did at that. And yeah, I think there is more to say to your point, and I hope to be able to say it. I will tell you, and this will surprise you none, that many efforts I've made in the last few months to engage, let's say, legacy media that I have relationships with that go back decades, they are scared to death to let me write anything about this. And it makes me think of something someone said in the book, one of the interviewers said in the book. He said, you can go to a cocktail party and you can talk about democracy or something like that. It'll be fine. But go to a cocktail party and just use the word capitalism. Just use it and just watch everybody walk away from you. And there is this is at the core of what we've already been talking about, but like the power structures in this country and across the Western world push back on any confrontation. They don't want that sort of anarchist practice of conversation. They don't want that. And so that's something that I've confronted in the months since I published this book. And I'm happy to be able to have these kinds of engaging conversations. But yeah, it's hard to figure out how to add more editorial and more input beyond sort of the initial oral history that I was able to do.
Yeah, and look, I mean, this conversation is great, and I was expecting, without knowing much about your work, I was expecting this was the conversation we were going to have. I'm happy to say that the way the book was written, it didn't feel slanted to me. I saw what you were doing, and I had a sense of what you were up to. But the book is something that I think, if you want to read this book as someone who thinks that the protesters got off easy, mm-hmm. and next time they need to listen to the sheriff and the state police and have more cops there, I think you can read that book. I think you can read this book pretty well. I read the book and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the names, with Reichert. I think the sheriff is the villain for me of this book, but you let him present himself as the hero. And if you voted for Reichert and were a big fan of him and you read this book, I think you would think, yeah, that Reichert, he stood up to those anarchists.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. Each reader will bring their own perspective to it and interpret it different ways. You're 100% right. For me, it's really about, there are people in the book who I would say, quote unquote, hang themselves, right? They just say things that as I was hearing, I was like, my God, I can't believe this is coming out of your mouth. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective you bring in that regard, in terms of how, if I guess I just wonder how many people who might interpret his words that way are willing to read this book. I hope they would be. But yeah, and I have to say too, just while we're on it too, in terms of like the element of policing in the book, I think it's really important to underscore that many reasons why Seattle was important. We've already named some of them, and another reason is this is where you get the modern militarization of the police departments, right? This is where you start to get that. This was the origin of that, and we've seen how that has just blown up in the 25 years since. And this matter of policing and what a few of and how they performed over the course of the protests became sort of the story, and the tension there between some of the police and the protesters became the media story in 1999. When I was talking to people about working this book and just sort of as a informal surveys, what do you remember from it? People always remembered that there were, a few people that smashed windows and police went crazy on them. And that's really all people remember. And to me, that was one of the things I really wanted to push back on too with this book is highlight that that's what happened and acknowledge that, but push past it to talk much more so about issues around globalization and the WTO.
Yeah, I mean, we'll need to get to window smashing. I'm hoping we can wrap this up in an hour. Maybe we won't get to everything I want to get to. I mean, I will say I want to talk about violence in that. It seems to me, from what I remember, and even more so from reading this book, that this is a successful, non-violent protest, with the exception of one obvious thing, which is that the cops are brutally violent. That's what the cops are. The fact that people can stand up in front of microphones, political figures can say with a straight face, "We will not tolerate violence, and that's why I've ordered the army in," is just an insane claim. But that's something that you just have to get used to if you want to live in the 21st century, that the army will be sent in the name of nonviolence. I wonder what those tanks are for. It looks like they're there for violence. And then, and I'm happy to say I've never been a fan of this person, John Zerzan and a few quote anarchists broke some windows. And if you want to argue that that's not violence, as they argue that it's not violence, you can say that it's at least, chaos, destruction, anarchy in the bad sense of anarchy. But with that said, at the end of the book, some of the forces of law and order are like, they said it was going to be a non-violent protest, and they were wrong. It was a violent protest. And it turns out what they meant is the people got on the streets and blocked people. Like, they're defining getting in the way of cars as violence. Now, that's not the happy no kings form of protest in which there's no conflict with the police, but the fact that that's what they register as violence is shocking. And then it's the classic, "I'm sorry I have to hit you with this stick, but you're standing and not moving, and if you're not moving, that's a violent act, and now I have to hit you."
Yeah, absolutely. It's a difference between, and that really stood out to me as I was talking to law enforcement. It was very clear. They had this broad definition of violence that the protesters and organizers didn't. And for me, it's the difference between violence and confrontation, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, so even just numbers, I think it's important to highlight that even in the book, you have organizers and law enforcement both saying that it was about 50 people that smashed some windows at a Nike and a Starbucks and so forth. 50 people about. That was estimates from law enforcement. We had 50,000 people there, right? So that's just really important to remember that. And there was never any claim of violence against people, right? So while the protesters, by and large, everyone had an agreement of nonviolence, and 50 people interpret that as allowing you to smash windows. And that's its own discussion, I think. I really do think that that's its own discussion. But the point is that became the story, and that wasn't the story. It was the 50,000 people in the streets. And to your point about blocking intersections, and the fact that was all that they were doing. I mean, yeah, that's the way to say it. That's all they were doing. because there were so many tactics too. I think this is important to recognize. You had people to show the range, right? You had some intersections that were blocked by people that were wearing lock boxes, right? Where you've seen these in other protests where you can lock arms through tubes, either big PVC plastic tubing or metal tubing, and you can lock your arms into those tubes, and you basically create a human chain that can't be broken unless you bring in saws and that kind of stuff. And that's a pretty hardcore approach. But there you go. And you're just sitting down in an intersection and you can't be moved. Another example is there were some women that called themselves the Red Noses. And they had clown noses and they wore them and they had a bunch of extra ones and they tried to get delegates to wear them as they were trying to make their way to the WTO and try to engage them in this humorous way, or had success doing so. And there's some pictures in the book of that, sort of delegates putting the noses on, one other delegate kind of brushing past, mad, not wanting to put the nose on. But the point is this, those are two very, very different tactics. And you had so many different tactics in between. You had David Solnit building huge puppets. You had marching bands blocking intersections, right? So there were, I think that's important because another part of this narrative, I think, is really crucial to understand, especially now in the context we're living in, is there was a huge tent. There was a left-right coalition, if you want to put it sort of in political terms. There was a left-right coalition you can't even dream up today. Ralph Nader was there, but also Pat Buchanan was there. And I'm no fan of Pat Buchanan, but there he was, right? Just as a point of fact, you had environmentalists, famously, you had environmentalists marching with AFL-CIO, unionists. I mean, that stuff doesn't happen. So I think, to me, that was one of the most heartening things about the story, too. That range of tactics, that broad commitment to nonviolence, meaning no harm to any human being, was so widely shared. And it ultimately became a police riot because the police were not willing to abide by those parameters.
Yeah, and then just the rule is the police are not allowed to riot. When the president does it, it's not illegal. When the police lose their minds and start smashing things, it's not a riot. That's just the rules.
Yeah, and we need to point out that not all, but some of the officers in the book, police officers in the book, they fully acknowledge that they were wrong. Like they see missteps, they see mistakes they made. Reichardt's not one of them for sure, but some of them do. And the chief of police, the Seattle Police Department, Norm Stamper, he famously, was absent, sort of disappeared that week. And, he reveals in the book, it's because his heart was with the protesters. Yeah. He felt so conflicted and didn't know what to do. So that's another thing too. We can talk about law enforcement, but we had all these layers, right? We had Seattle Police Department. We had the King County Sheriff. We had FBI and Secret Service because Bill Clinton's coming to town. And so those layers are important to identify because it seems really clear that things really became violent when the federal law enforcement agencies, the Secret Service, and the FBI said, okay, we have to do something. Bill Clinton's coming to town. Do something now. And that's when things started to turn. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, no, it's crucial. And this leads me into one of my favorite talking points. So one is we're supposed to hate and fear anarchy. But in fact, if Hobbes says you're in anarchy as long as there isn't one centralized source of violent power that can keep everyone in line, well, then we are in anarchy anytime you're somewhere where there's the sheriff, the feds, the local cops. There is not the government doesn't work that way. There is not a centralized force of violence in the government. You've got the state police and the sheriff yelling at the local cops, and then the FBI and Secret Service come in and escalate everything. That's anarchy right there.
Great point.
Reichert, at one point, he doesn't use the phrase mutual aid, but I think he says we had networks of mutual understanding, and that's why cops came from all over the state. So literally, I mean, that's how being a cop works. Being a cop works on mutual aid. It's mutual aid that is deployed for coercion and violence and not the care we want it to be. But the cops would fall apart if things worked on violence, coercion, and hierarchy. That's why they talk about the brotherhood and things like that. The brotherhood is equality, sharing, and caring. The cops work on mutual aid. the anarchists are the best organized. And they've been saying that since the 19th century as well. The people who really know what's going on, who really share information well, who are really connected, often the people who know the laws the best are the anarchists. And if you accept a Bill Clinton centrist view of the world, you'll think the cops are the forces of order and the anarchists are disorganized. But in fact, the cops are disorganized and the anarchists have it together. And this is why when people say, "Oh, you want to live in an anarchist world, Graham, everything would fall apart," and I'm like, "Shit, what are you talking about? Have you paid attention to anything?" Sorry.
No, I mean, man, I put that in an essay, man. Please put that down on paper, because you just articulated it really well. That inversion, that's 100% accurate. I mean, you were talking broadly, but that was accurate in Seattle. The anarchists were the most organized, most, I mean, everything. My God, the organization was amazing in terms of how they broke into groups, which intersection you would be blocking, your tactics, how you communicated with each other. They had a spokes council, so intensely organized, and nothing but a just shit show with law enforcement. And they admit it again and again. They just had no idea what was happening until it was upon them. And even then they were sort of lost in the fog of it all. And absolutely, that inversion, I think, is important to notice. And I also think that, I mean, it might be, I don't want to get in the weeds or like some kind of semantics thing, but I will just put a pin in this notion that I think that one of the hurdles for anarchism is the word itself, the popular use, the popular use of that word. And I think that a lot of people rely on the popular use of the word anarchy and then aren't willing to sort of look at what anarchism is. And I think it's a genuine barrier. I just put a pin in that. Like, I really genuinely, I think there are a lot of like middle of the road people out there that like might be interested in really invigorating conversations, but just never go there because of that starting point.
Yeah. I mean, look, so this is where I started the podcast. You ask people, do you like Tolstoy? Do you like Gandhi? Do you like King? Do you like Thoreau? Yes, all down the line. Yes, 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 yes. Do you like anarchism? No, that's the worst thing. What if I told you that those people I started with the list are all anarchists, or at least deeply? I mean, 3 of them are anarchists, and King is, let's say, deeply influenced by anarchism at the very least. Yeah, I mean, look, this comes up very early in the book. A variety of people, and not even necessarily people farther on the right, if you want to say, of the protesters, complain about the anarchists, by which they mean Zerzan and the window smashers. To me, if you're going to stand in an intersection and say no to the state, then that's anarchist enough for me. My God, I liked the No Kings protest. That wasn't anarchism. It wasn't direct action. It was political demonstration. Anyone who gets in the street is channeling Thoreau and is doing anarchism.
Yeah. Civil disobedience. And I think that you're right about like sort of referencing No Kings. I mean, again, great to see millions of people putting their voices out there. But the bottom line is, if you don't have actions, if you don't have goals for your gathering, then you're wasting the opportunity. You're really wasting the opportunity. And again, I that's what stood out to me. The organizers, they had a goal. They're like, we want to shut down this meeting. We don't want them to reach that agreement. That was a goal. They stated it. And I mean, when do you have that? You have to go back to, I think, civil rights era to even sort of find, you have to go back 50, 60, 70 years to find any kind of comparable, similar, measures on that scale. So I think this is important. So as you look forward, how can you bring protest into action spaces? And how can you incorporate civil disobedience? And I will say this, that so many Americans, I think, especially talking to people around the country doing this book, they love the idea of civil disobedience when it's in black and white. They love it when it was like decades ago and it's in a history book and they're like, man, look at those heroes. Man, John Lewis, he crossed that bridge, and they love this stuff. But when you put it in their face today, right now, civil disobedience today, let's block the highway. They freak out. It's something, it's very difficult to handle anarchism, civil disobedience in real time.
Yeah, and I would say they made it, the WTO made it easy for them. So if you're Extinction Rebellion and you shut down the streets of London, there's a lot of people who are trying to take their kids to daycare and then go to their job as a nurse, and they can't get to work. And not only them, but also their neighbors is pissed and are like, these anarchists, throw them all in jail. And the climate crisis is real, and it's a crisis. And if I thought shutting down the city of London for a day was going to get action in the climate crisis, I would say it was worth people getting pissed off. But when you do that, I think you actually get people angry at Extinction Rebellion, and they're like, I hate whales now. I just wanted to get to work. Whereas the WTO people, like, nobody was like, oh no, these rich douchebags want to run the world for corporations, and some Seattle moms are in their way. I hate those Seattle moms. Like, they made it so easy, and they learned better. It wasn't that easy ever again.
Oh, you're so right. And yeah, this comes up in conversations in the book for sure. Absolutely. You have to be tactical. It's not just about, I reference block the highway. It's not just block the highway for the sake of blocking the highway. Be strategic. Block the highway when Donald Trump is making his approach, like, so to speak, right? Like you have to be strategic and think about the effects of what the actions are that you create, and who will be caught up in those effects for sure. You're looking for coalition building. You're not looking to create more fractures. Yeah.
Okay, so one last thing I want to hit before we head towards the end. If I tell you that I lived in Pittsburgh between the years of 2009 and 2011, do you know what I'm referencing?
Oh, man. Wait, give me a second. No, I don't know what you're referencing.
I believe it was the G8 at the time. Okay. Maybe it was the G7 was held in Pittsburgh in that 2-year period. I didn't look up when it was. I think it was 2010. And speaking of shutting down highways, I sat for an hour because the highways were shut down, not by the anarchists, because Barack Obama was coming through. So this is again, another, like, you're allowed to shut down the highways if you're the government. But in that time period, during those protests, which were a tiny, tiny reflection of the battle in Seattle, one angry teenager, I don't know where he was from, I heard he was from Chicago, smashed windows. And he smashed the window of Pamela's, the beloved pancake place in the local neighborhood. And when we all woke up the next day, after the G7 or G8 or whatever was over, and found out that this one teenager wearing black had broken the windows of our pancake place, and he thought that this was somehow a protest against capitalism. I mean, that was my Battle of Seattle, and I didn't attend the protest, and I didn't care, and almost no one did. I mean, that was just nothing. Like, they had it locked down. Like, they had learned from Seattle. But this idea that if you break windows, and it comes up in the book, no one's being harmed except for insurance or something. Well, the people who are being harmed are the people who have to clean up that glass, the people who can't go to that business. If you break Citigroup or Chase Bank's windows, that doesn't hurt Citigroup or Chase Bank. It doesn't hurt their insurers. It only hurts the poor people who have to clean it up. And reading this book, I was most sickened by Reichert. And then I was second most sickened by John Zerzan. And that's just like, hey, we're not hurting. Just like, if that's what anarchism is, I don't want it. I don't want it.
Yeah, John Zerzan, man, he can really set people off. That's for sure. And worth pointing out too. Let's just say Reichert. We need to point out that last year, or what? No, 2024. He was the Republican candidate for governor in the state of Washington. Those are just great points you make in terms of like and I think ultimately for me, like I asked myself so many questions as I was talking to people, like, what are my own personal lines? Like, how do I feel about this? Sort of what lines you cross, how you define violence. And I do think that in the US, we, and again, Medea Benjamin makes this argument, we get so bent out of shape about property damage in a way they don't, like, can say even in Europe. Like, you put a fire in a car, that's normal for like a protest. In the US, you damage property, it's like, oh my God, the sky's falling in. So
I have to interrupt and say, if the local sporting team wins a championship, you are allowed for some reason to destroy cars, and it doesn't count as right. I'm not kidding. Like, that's It's
It's
true. If the
weird.
giants win, you can destroy the cities, but not to
Yeah.
stop the WTO. I'm sorry. Continue.
Put a pin in that because I think that's something to return to at some point. Yeah, that's a fascinating point to make. But yeah, so we're preoccupied with the destruction of property in the U.S., and I think that's really important to point out as we have this discussion. But to the core of the point you're making, what does it do to Citibank if you smash the windows? It does absolutely nothing. I mean, honestly, I was watching protest video this morning. I think it was in London at a Ritz-Carlton, and someone under the Christmas tree at the Ritz-Carlton dumped giant bags of shit. Horse shit. And somehow that almost seemed a little bit more effective to me than smashing a window. Like I think that and David Solit does this in the book with all of his, and all over the course of his lifetime with all of the organizing he's done, bringing theater and puppets and culture into organizing. You do have to be creative. I think less blunt force and more creativity. So instead of smashing Citibank's window, I think it's worth thinking about what other physical actions can you take? Even if it's taking physical actions, you're dying to take physical actions against a Citibank property. There are other actions you can take that I think are going to be more effective, that don't go straight to notions of violence for some people, and are more like playful or more approachable. I think you'll bring more people into the discussion if you take a more creative approach as opposed to blunt force.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, there was plenty of that in 99, obviously, most famously, the WTO this way, democracy the other way, enormous banner that was unfolded.
Yeah, 300 feet in the air.
Yeah. All right, look, we hit everything I wanted to hit, and it's just time for me to say, what else do you want to make sure people know about this book, about this event, about what it means?
I think if there's one thing I would want to really highlight for everyone, it's the thing I always remind myself of, because I don't think I'm alone when I say I have a lot of mornings I wake up and I feel really pretty powerless and sometimes hopeless. I want to encourage people to remember what we were talking about near the beginning of the conversation about this sort of hybrid between the internet and the real world, right? And if you are feeling like you're just fed up with the world and you want to engage in a way that is productive and doesn't feel hopeless, I'm telling you, talk to your neighbors. Like, go as local as you can possibly go. And that pothole that's driving you all bonkers, or that issue in your small town or your big city that's driving everyone on your block bonkers, focus in on that. You will quickly see how that sort of quote unquote small thing that you focus in on can become quite big and substantial. It's meaningful for you because it's something you engage in your daily life, but you'll also find people in the next town over, or the next state over, the next country over, that are facing similar issues. And that's what the internet allows you to do. So I think start in the real world. Don't lead with social media. Don't lead with the internet. Internet's a tool. Social media is a tool, but have all of your organizing, have all of your actions and efforts start in the real world as locally as possible. I promise that's where you'll feel the most power you can feel. I mean that word in the most positive sense I can mean it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that's fantastic advice. I'm struck. I frequently teach Donna Haraway's essay "Cyborg Manifesto," where she says in the digital world, and this was written almost 50 years ago, we're all cybernetic organisms. We are all part our flesh and blood lives and part the virtual systems we are a part of. I think that activism has become pretty purely virtual for a lot of people. And we're all going to be cyborgs now, short of a Zerzan style anarcho-primitivist. And he has a radio show, so he's a cyborg also. I don't see him just living in a mountain and not talking to anyone. Short of that, you're going to be a cyborg. You've got to put the physical part first, and that has to be the core, and the virtual part of it can grow out of that. That's where the tendrils comes from. That's where the networking comes from. But if you don't put your life with the people around you first, if you talk to anarchists all the time on Discord and never organize with your neighbors about what you want to have in your community, you've done it backwards.
100%. And we do it backwards. That's how we do it. We do it backwards. So if we can just point that out, underscore, just invert it. Yeah, lead with the real world. Let the real world lead. Like, absolutely, we need to invert the prevailing model that's out there right now. Yeah.
Well, I say we can leave it at that. The book is 1 Week to Change the World. The author is D.W. Gibson. And I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was fantastic.
I appreciate it, Graham. It's been an awesome conversation. Thanks, man.